Would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom?
To Anti-Tyranny News Radio here on UCY.TV. Thank you for joining me this evening. We're going to kind of jump right into a Ron Paul Liberty Report, and I have some other news that kind of relates to it, but this has to do with the little speech that Trump had at the UN. A lot of you might have already listened to it or heard it or watched it live on TV. It was kind of a lengthy speech, but I kind of side with Ron Paul on this one, and I'll play Ron Paul Liberty Report here in a minute. It had a lot of war rhetoric that, for me, it seemed to really kind of throw, jabs at a lot of countries. But then there were a few things that he talked about, national sovereignty. I think that the countries are sovereign, and the people within the countries are sovereign to themselves too. But with a lot of what the rhetoric that he also put out there, it's, for me, it's almost a two-faced thing without completely being two-faced, because we know what the United States does and has done in recent history, and it kind of goes against what he talks about when it comes to the sovereignty of countries. But I'll get into this Ron Paul Liberty Report, and this one's titled "Trump's UN Speech: A Neocon's Dream." So we'll get into this.
The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you. Congratulations on your program this week. You did two programs.
Your fans missed you.
Oh, I don't know.
Almost a revolution.
They said you did well. You did well.
Glad you're back, sir.
But good to see you. I'm glad to be back also. And I think that we will talk a little bit, as our introduction indicated, a little bit about that major speech. It's too bad I wasn't around. I might like to have tweeted during that speech. I'd have been motivated, I'll tell you, with some of the things that went on. But you have to really search for something really good in it. So we won't pretend to put lipstick on you-know-what. No, we can't do that. But, it's to me a shame because, we in the libertarian camp, it shouldn't be too difficult to be critical of this aggressive nature of this speech and an aggressive nature of the foreign policy. I think all libertarians should be concerned about a speech like this. Good constitutional conservatives should be. Yeah. But I would think there would be more support coming from the traditional anti-war left, the progressives. But we don't hear a whole lot. We'd get some, and we get them on our program. But that doesn't seem to be in the cards yet. But there's lots to talk about in this speech, but I don't think there's much reassurance that we're going to be moving in the right direction. Fire and fury, it reminds me of shock and awe. Mm-hmm. And shock and awe was going to be, wonderful, mission accomplished and all these wonderful things. And it turned into be a nightmare. So if Trump has his way and he feels compelled to live up to his promises, even if it doesn't make any sense, how's it going to be turned on? In a way, you can make the case for saying if he does that, if he destroys North Korea, it isn't like getting rid of a regime or something, a little bit more modest, destroys the whole country. This could end up a lot worse than the mission unaccomplished in Iraq. And that unaccomplished mission in Iraq and the Middle East, that's still ongoing, and that's been 16 years. So, but this has potential greater harm, even though if we weren't following this confrontational foreign policy and trying to provoke this goofy guy into doing something, we probably wouldn't have a problem. It always bothers me. It seems to be so artificial and so unnecessary.
Yeah, and if it's just talk, if he's just trying to go up there and sound like a tough guy, it's extremely irresponsible for a world leader to talk that way. But if he's actually serious and he's talking about utterly destroying North Korea, i.e. the country, he's talking about killing 25 million people. And we know the Chinese said just a week or so ago that they will not allow an attack on North Korea unless North Korea attacks someone else first. So if they're true to their word, which they have been so far, they're not going to allow the U.S. to attack. So we're talking about orders of magnitude more than 25 million people. So what exactly does he mean by this?
Well, he can't possibly mean it. I have to confess, I made a wrong assumption or a hope that I thought the speech would be much more toned down, more in the spirit of what he did at the State of the Union message, because even some of his enemies say, hey, that's at least a little bit better tone. I thought he would take advantage of this, but it seems like he thrives in this provoking. I think that if he doesn't provoke somebody, he's not satisfied. I think this is a personality quirk that he has, that he needs this for some reason, and that he gets a sense of power from this if he can provoke you. If he doesn't provoke you, just think of the very first night of the first debate. Yeah. With Megyn Kelly, it was provoke, and it was so successful. That he gets all the attention. So this had a lot of that spirit in there. It's provoking, and he throws in a few words. This is national sovereignty. We're for national sovereignty. Of course, I'd like the national sovereignty to be there to protect individual sovereignty and individual responsibility. He talks about it, but then he mixes it in with the nation state. And that makes me a little bit nervous about the power of the nation state, where you combine the state itself with the cultural and ethnic portions of a country. And I think that approach is almost a theocracy. And also that some of the bad regimes around the world over the centuries have been those who called themselves a nation state. And that his argument is that the nation's responsibility is to enhance the quality of the people. And yet, for me and so many, the people, the human condition he talked about, can only be enhanced by the people. That's why I find a limitation on what I advocate, with limited government, because ultimately, if the people aren't mature enough and understanding enough and assume responsibility for themselves, no matter what you do in government, you can't make people do that. So people have to understand what liberty is and respond in a positive way. So I have that was sort of buried in his speech about the human condition, but it just once again fits into the category of using an authoritarian approach to improve the human condition. Of course, we could argue we wanted to do that too, but we want to do it with freedom, free markets and sound money and limited government and staying out of war. That would improve the human condition. I don't think he's quite with us on our approach on how to improve the human condition.
And the roadmap to that is subsidiarity, which is the opposite of what he's talking about. I think a good argument could be made that the human condition was probably better off when there were hundreds of little mini kingdoms around Europe, when the person who you were responsible to was right there in your village or something of this rather than some faraway Washington, D.C.
Right.
But, with a couple of things really stood out and almost, I would say, didn't pass the laugh test, but I didn't laugh because it wasn't funny. But you talk about the U.S. with a global military empire with thousands of military bases in 100 and some countries, involved in so many wars and conflicts, regime changes, overthrows. And how do you put that side by side with what he said here? Strong sovereign nations let diverse countries with different values, different cultures, and different dreams not just coexist, but work side by side on the basis of mutual respect. It's almost as if he's deranged.
Yeah, and of course, his opposition to the UN supposedly really is a facade too, because I think all our presidents for a long time have used the UN. And it's not like they run roughshod over us. There was a time when I believed that was the case, that we were paying for everything and they were always picking on us. But I don't believe that anymore. I think we've used the UN. If we want to put on sanctions, we rush to the UN and we badger and we get the vote. Almost always. If we want support for an invasion. I remember so clearly the Persian Gulf War when H.W. Bush said that, well, we need to go in. And they said, well, you don't have authority from the Congress. He was pretty arrogant about this, and that was unusual for his demeanor. He said, no, I don't need that. I have a UN resolution. And but then the Congress, for political reasons, he said, well, if they want to give me permission, let them have a resolution. So everybody was happy. The Congress got to participate in it, and they got the authority. But it didn't really serve as a declaration of war, and it didn't find out who the enemy was, and it never had an end stage to the fighting that went on.
This, came home to me when you were doing 1146 to get the U.S. out of the UN, and we got a lot of surprising. I thought, I guess I was naive, I thought that the conservatives would be on board. The liberals, the left, hated it because they liked the idea of world government, this sort of thing. But remember how the conservatives resisted. They said, no, we don't want to get out of the UN. We want to control the UN and force them to do what we want.
Well, what was funny is they gave me support when we didn't have control of the House.
Yeah.
And then once we got control of the House, he said, Ron, we don't need you now. Yeah. We were just pretending. He said, don't bring that resolution up. And the foreign aid was the same thing. Yeah. All the Republicans would vote against the foreign aid. And then when they were in charge, they had to get this passed. But that's tradition. That fits into the argument I make that there's only about one party there.
Yeah, exactly. Here's another thing that I picked out. And again, it's not a laugh test. It's a discuss test, I guess. But here's what he said. In America, we do not seek to impose our way of life on anyone, but rather to let it shine as an example for everyone to watch. And then in the same speech, he went on to say, the United States has taken important steps to hold the Venezuelan regime accountable. We're prepared to take further action. It's time for the entire world to join us in demanding that Iran's government end its pursuit of death and destruction, and so on and so on. So he said, we don't push people around. Then he goes ahead and starts pushing everyone around.
Originally, it was the axis of evil, and they had the three country. But Iraq is not part of that anymore because we have total control.
We've liberated it.
But now the axis has expanded to include other countries, and that, of course, is the problem. But, people who oppose the United Nations from the very beginning understood, what could happen. And I became very much aware of it very early on because, and I remember it clearly, it was just 5 years after World War II ended and the war was starting up. And I remember the conversation or heard my mother speaking. I was at that time, I'd probably be about 15. I heard her speaking. I don't know whether this country can stand just another war. She was just lamenting the fact that there'd be another war without going into the details at all. But there it was. And where did that come from? The authority came from the United Nations. So in many ways, the seeds of all this mess I lay at the doorstep of world government, because they went along with this, and the UN was set up to bring peace to the world. The first thing they did was start a war, and they planted a lot of bad seeds in the Middle East as well. So they're not a peacekeeping nation at all. They endorse the issue of sanctions, they endorse the war, they get the resolutions, and they go on and on. Every once in a while they throw out a resolution, but how often do they pass a resolution against Saudi Arabia? Have they done much of that? I don't think so.
No, and in addition, remember we talked about before in 2006 when they adopted the concept of responsibility to protect, R2P, which means if the nations get together and decide that one country is not doing enough to protect its people, or he's a rogue leader, then they feel like they have the authority. Whereas it was, for all of its faults, it was at least imagined as a collection of sovereign nations who retain their sovereignty. That was about the only good thing about it.
Yeah, and I think we're at a time, and this is an issue we've talked about before, is that we will and are in the process of overstepping our bounds. Although we're still the kingpin, and although it's our empire, and although we have the reserve currency of the world, and although we can spend endless money, and whether we have $5 trillion doubled to $10 trillion, doubled to $20 trillion in a short period of time, getting ready to double to $40 trillion, there's a limit. And there's a limit to our foreign policy. There's a limit to us pushing people around. And I think there will not be an invasion of the United States. I think the fact that they can beat the war drums and build up enough fear in the American people. Right now, more than half the people think that we should attack North Korea, like they were going to come here. And it makes no more sense than the lies they told us about Iraq. So they push this and they build up the fear. But we build up a lot of enemies, and I think the attack on us will be on the dollar, and people are starting to prepare for this. It's a very fragile system, and there's a tremendous contribution to that. There's a lot of other factors, too, the number one culprit being the Federal Reserve. But they work in collusion for this anyway. This is how this gets financed. We couldn't have these deficits if you didn't have the Federal Reserve financing it. But I think it's coming to an end, and we're overstepping our bounds. And this type of speech we just heard is an example of bombast. Just saying that we are the exceptional Americans. We know what is best, and put out a few phrases there that we are so kind and considerate, and we can worry about your sovereignty, and we want peace and prosperity. And I think that the majority of American people, when you do some polling, you find out that the people are disgusted, and they are very distrustful of our government, and rightfully so.
And you say bombast, and that's right. It almost smacks of desperation, too, because, look, here's the United States that has essentially lost every war it's been in since World War II. It just lost Syria. Unfortunately, many thousands others lost more than just a war. They lost their lives, lost Syria, lost Afghanistan. It's lost Iraq. It's lost Libya. Here's a country that can't defeat a bunch of tribesmen in mountains in Afghanistan. It really does almost smack of desperation, rattling the guns and threatening everyone. Well, in reality, it looks more like a paper tiger.
Right. And I think that people will realize that, but there'll be a lot of people who will love this speech. The neocons are loving it.
John Bolton was giddy.
Yeah.
Alien Abrams was thrilled.
Very, very excited. So how would you like to summarize this, and what do you expect good to come of it? Or is this just another burden for us to bear?
Well, I think his true colors have shown. I don't think anyone that even had some small hopes, myself included, that he might come around, are feeling pretty desperate. But, like in a good movie, they always have a bonus reel of things. And so I thought I would bring out a bonus reel. And here's Nikki Haley, the greatest diplomat in the history of the universe. Here's what she tweeted after the speech. If you remember, Saudi Arabia was on the Human Rights Commission, and there was some. Here's what she said: "Human rights are too important to let some of the worst abusers sit on the Human Rights Commission, UN Human Rights Commission."
And I think Saudi Arabia is involved in a war with us against the Yemenis.
Yeah.
At the same time, the last time the Iranians, who are the monsters also, the last time they were involved in a war was in 1980. And they were fighting Iraq when we promoted that war and supported Iraq. And we essentially, that was left as a stalemate. But certainly it wasn't a victory, for our side. And the bigger picture here is something we've talked about, is also important. We talk about the individual things, Korea and Ukraine and all these other areas. But the big picture to me is us determined to be involved in the big fight between the Saudi faction and the Iranian faction. And I think, and that's Sunni, Shia, and the West and the East, and the Soviets and the U.S., and I think you can line up the ducks, a bunch of countries on one side and on the other. And it's almost like, what happens if they have a fight over there and we're not there? Yeah. And we almost feel like we have to help get it started, and provoke it. That to me is the sad part, but that's not going to go away. But it would be quieted down if we had a bit of a different attitude and a different approach. So I was hopeful that the tone would be different and that our president would be a little more calm about this situation, because I think that his presentation is not what we need. And some are critical of it, rightfully so, but others will love it. And I think that, yes, once again, we're being threatened. We need a strong president. We want to be safe. We don't want the North Koreans to come and invade us and take away our liberties. Well, what you ought to really worry about is our own government taking away our liberties. Just think of what happened in the early part of this century, the Patriot Act and the NDAA and all the usurpation of our civil liberties. That's where the real concern is. The invasion by a foreign power to destroy our liberty is not going to come in our lifetime. It's going to be the lack of confidence and desire to live in a free country and put the pressure on our own government to stay out of this entangling alliances, these useless wars that make no sense whatsoever, and paying for them with printing press money, which is going to undermine the prosperity of this country. So stick with us, because we're going to continue to support peace and prosperity. It's conceivable. It's understandable. I think the American people want it. I think the people of the world want it if they aren't influenced by the propagandists who promote war and conflict. Please look at it carefully, because there is an answer to this mess that we're in, and it's found in something that traditionally was very much in the American spirit. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.
Ron Paul Liberty Report, RonPaulLibertyReport.com, and Ron Paul Liberty Report on YouTube. Check them out. Subscribe. Now, it's pretty easy for someone like Trump. We already kind of know that ego that he tends to exhibit. Whenever we have these presidents now, they are able to sit here and really, put out that rhetoric. And there's one reason behind that, is that they've basically been granted war powers. They have been able to go into Libya, Syria, Iraq, again, since World War II, really, Congress, does not declare wars. Which kind of brings me to this article from Reason.com. Congress does not want its war power. And I'll kind of get into a little theory I have about that. But here it says the short-lived CBS series Brain Dead, now available on Netflix, is a science fiction satire about an invasion of Washington, D.C. by extraterrestrial bugs that crawl into people's ears and hijack their minds as part of a plot to conquer the world. But the most implausible aspect of the story is a dramatic Senate committee vote on whether to authorize military action in Syria. In the real world, of course, no such vote is necessary, because the president does whatever he wants with the armed forces he controls, while Congress abdicates its constitutional responsibility to decide when the country should go to war. Last week, 61 senators showed they are happy with the situation by tabling an amendment that would have forced a debate about endless um, metastasizing wars that cost trillions of dollars and thousands of lives without making Americans any safer. The amendment introduced by Senator Rand Paul would have repealed the 2001 authorization for the use of military force against the perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks and the 2002 resolution approving the war in Iraq. The repeal would have taken effect in 6 months, giving Congress time to consider the justification for continued U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq and the various other countries supposedly covered by those resolutions. Quote, the war in Afghanistan has gone on 16 years now, Paul said, before the vote on this amendment. We have had people who will be fighting in the war in the next year or so who were not yet born on 9/11. We have long since killed the people who perpetrated 9/11. Says here, for years, Donald Trump opposed what has become America's longest war, calling it a total and complete disaster that has wasted an enormous amount of blood and treasure. After becoming president, he changed his mind, reaffirming the U.S. commitment to remain in the country where, by his own account, we don't know what we are doing. But as far as 61 senators are concerned, there is nothing to debate here. Barack Obama said in 2001, AUMF should be repealed because it was dangerously obsolete. He nevertheless claimed it authorized military action against ISIS, which did not exist. When the resolution was passed, Obama belatedly sought congressional permission for that war while insisting he did not need to. But as far as 61 senators are concerned, there is nothing to debate here. Paul notes that Congress never approved U.S. intervention in Libya, Syria, Yemen, Nigeria, or Somalia. As a presidential candidate, Trump criticized such ham-handed meddling in foreign civil wars. As president, not so much, but as far as 61 senators are concerned, there is nothing to debate here. You can read the rest of the article at reason.com. And now we have give me a second here trying to pull this up. We have Russia talking about Russia that will target U.S. forces in Syria if provoked. Now you also have North Korea basically lashing out, I guess you could call it. I have an article here from Reason, and it's titled McCain Disses Graham and Cassidy, Kim Jong-un disses Trump. Now, if we're expecting any of this to end anytime soon, I think we're definitely not looking at the big picture, definitely when it comes to Trump. The longer Trump's in office. Now, what I will say, there's a lot of things that are not a threat. For now, I don't see, the government to come and start seizing people's guns. I don't think that's a threat under Trump. Where if we would have had Hillary Clinton, you know, of course, under Barack Obama, it was something that you feared. But what I've also noticed with Trump is he can be a little unhinged if the Republicans aren't doing what he wants. He'll go to the Democrats and he'll make deals. He's a deal maker. That can become dangerous. He's not showing that right now. But I think a lot of that has to deal with his base, how far he's willing to go, and, you know, kind of, well, my base might be able to hold this jab, but you start trying to pass gun laws or something like that, you probably will lose all of his base. So there's things that are not under, you know, scrutiny in a way that threatens your right to own something or have something in that sense, and, you know, maybe firearms. But there's a lot of uncertainty. And, you know, we said this during the primaries that he is the unknown. It's Trump. You don't know what he's going to do. And people were willing to vote for that over Hillary, which they basically knew and expected what would happen under Hillary. And they didn't like it. Hillary, the only reason you got a lot of votes is because you have large populations in these large liberal cities on the coastlines. But when you look at area, you didn't have support. That's where Trump got you. And a lot of it has to do with your positions on things. We had 8 years of that type of radical agenda. And you walk around with a chip on your shoulder all the time and want to push that type of radical agenda, that scares people. Where Obama, you know, he was still somehow able to make people feel a little bit more at ease at the beginning. You don't. That's where the difference was. That's why you couldn't get the flyover nation here. You couldn't win that. Because these are the people that hunt, fish. These are people that do it every, you know, day. Grow up with, you know, firearms. And the left that are part of these liberal cities with their, you know, elitist status and their security can't understand why the everyday person wouldn't want to defend themselves. And you watch the news and you wonder why maybe they rather defend themselves and give up their right to defend themselves and rely on law enforcement. And that's not a jab at law enforcement. Guess what, law enforcement? You've been given an impossible job. Definitely in liberal cities where people aren't legally allowed to defend themselves. You've been given an impossible job. generations, decades, you know, laws and more law enforcement have not stopped crime. And people are safer when they're able to defend themselves. And crime goes down when a population defends itself. Doesn't go away, it goes down. The idea that you can eradicate hate or crime, that's a fantasy. That's that utopia. A lot of people think libertarians think that way. You get rid of government, all crime will go away. No, who said that? That's not what libertarians believe. We believe the bigger the state gets and the less rights people have, the more dangerous the situation for the people becomes. That's what you have in a prison system. The only difference is they don't have concrete walls, bars, and razor wire. Or will they if you give all power to the state? Well, you have to get in your, little line so you can get assigned a job for the day. And then after that job, you can go and get another line and get your loaf of bread and something to take home to the family. If you have a family left. We've seen state control and what it does. Okay. Give me a second here. Now, one thing that I played stuff from We Are Change about it and others. I got one here from Stefan Molyneux. And it's about online advertising. And for alternative media, conservatives, libertarians, it's been a lot of people have been getting targeted on YouTube, on Google ads, and marked as not suited for advertisers. And I really think it does advertisers injustice, because a lot of these people have a lot of traffic and they're not, non-advertiser friendly. They're just not in line with the ideology of Google and its liberal, culture. And I'll get into this clip and we'll talk about this after this clip here. Stefan Molyneux, Death of Online Advertising.
Everybody, Stefan Molyneux from Free Domain Radio. Browsing the news this morning, today, came across an interesting article. Now, this is a bit business, it's a bit techy, but I was an entrepreneur for many years, so I hope you'll forgive me. But it's really, really important as far as understanding what is really driving online economies these days. And the article is called, Hey Advertisers, the Data Mining Emperor Has No Clothes. And we'll put a link to this below. So there's this belief in online advertising that, you comb through everyone's demographics and you comb through their preferences and their past histories and Lord knows what else they're opening up, what kimonos they're ripping wide. But you can figure out how to target potential purchasers with surgical laser-like precision. And, you've got massive server farms grinding through every conceivable online algorithm to try and find what it is that you want to buy next. And some people say, like, online advertising has actually exceeded television advertising spending in 2016. And traditional media advertising kind of stagnating, kind of declining. And online advertising is going nuts, particularly in, like, mobile phones and stuff like that. And here's the thing, though. Online advertising doesn't really work that well, according to some measures. So Procter & Gamble, a big company, they recently announced a huge reduction in their online social media advertising spending. And this huge reduction, this cost savings, had no measurable effect on sales. So they cut back a whole bunch of advertising, and it had no measurable effect on sales. So that's a data point that's important to consider. There's also something in online advertising called click fraud. So what's clicking on these ads may not actually be human beings who are interested in the product and might purchase it, but they're automated bots. Like they're hoovering up money from competitors and from advertisers and so on. Well, how do you know it's a real person, or how do you know if it's a bot? And this is important, right? There are these click farm sites out there in the world. And if you pay them, then they will go and click on a whole bunch of ads. And maybe you're using this to dampen the fiscal prospects of your competitor. And that's kind of important. Click fraud is not obviously much discussed by people selling online advertising. The numbers are kind of kept pretty quiet. And so there's all of this, it's a huge market, it's a fast-growing market, and, if you walk past a Subway shop and an ad pops up on your phone saying, here's $1 off a sub, then, boy, they're just going to come in and buy a sub and so on. Because the whole idea behind online advertising is you can somehow predict what someone is going to buy next based on what they bought previously. I'll give you a personal example, right? So I have a studio, it gets a little musty, so I bought a little air cleaner. And of course, after I bought the air cleaner, hey, you want an air cleaner? Would you like an air cleaner? Can I get an air cleaner for you? And it's like, no, I just bought one. I guess if you take one back, you want a different one, but that's not hugely common, right? Because, I do my research before I buy. Like most people, money is precious, so I want to make sure I'm not wasting it. So think of the things that you buy online, or whether some digital record. Think of the things that you buy. How many of them are you going to buy again soon? Like, you just bought a tablet. Hey, would you like a tablet? Would you like it? It doesn't make any sense. And so this whole industry is based on, well, if you can figure out what people bought previously, you'll figure out what they can buy next. Now, that is true for repetitive purchase items, right? It's groceries, gas, that kind of stuff. But in order to get someone to shift their preferences from one gas station to another, or from one grocery store to another, you have to offer them the kind of discounts that will pretty quickly put you out of business if you're not careful. So that is important, right? If you just bought a plane ticket to Buenos Aires, are you likely to buy another one soon? Hey, if I got a plane ticket to you understand? It's like trying to drive at high speed, only looking in the rear view. It doesn't really help. Is there all of this data mining? Does it actually help advertisers target you when you're about to buy something? I mean, even if we assume that you haven't installed ad blocking software, which of course is not mentioned a lot by people who are trying to sell this kind of advertising, just think of your own behavior. I invite business people to think of this, to just think of your own behavior. There's a couple of things. First of all, if there are going to be enough ads to help cover the costs of some website and so on, then it's like, you load up a shotgun with a bunch of postage stamps. You just burst them straight at the screen. Okay, so you get this big smorgasbord. Now, of course, in certain, I think it's on iOS, there's like Reader View, which strips stuff out. There's ad blocking software. There are entire ad blocking browsers, which will hide things and so on. So have you ever looked at one of those ads and clicked on it and ended up buying something? People are nervous as well because there are phishing scams, there are fraud sites, not everything goes through vetting. And Equifax just put out a communication that had people clicking on a phishing scam or something like that. I mean, so there's some little blur. Now, either they're innocuous, in which case you just don't even see them, or they're blaring, in which case they're annoying. You know, you got your volume turned up because you were listening to In Excess, say, and then boom, someone's trying to sell you something in your eardrum, and it's like, now I'm just annoyed. Now I'm just frustrated. So there have been studies as well which show that millennials in particular, like the tune-out ads, they can study like eye movement when you look. They don't even look at the ads. They don't register. They don't show up or anything like that. And as for this, while you're walking past a sub shop and boom, a coupon pops up on your phone, a lot of people find that kind of creepy. Like, don't know where I am at all times, advertiser people. Like, that's just kind of weird because, you know, people's security and privacy settings and so on, whether they've even got location on, whether they're in airplane mode because, you know, it's right next to your body. You don't necessarily want all that radiation and so on. It is kind of creepy when an ad pops up and says, oh, I see you're at such and such a location. Would you like a coupon? It's like, ugh, get out of my life. Get out of my life. So this question of online advertising and whether it works, it's really, really tough. And, you know, I invite everyone out there, you know, particularly if you're involved in buying these kinds of ads, you know, this combat between advertisers and consumers, like a television station doesn't exist to deliver shows to you. It exists to deliver you to advertisers. And the shows are like the bait. The hook is the advertising. So the problem, of course, is that the people want the shows. They don't want the ads. So what do? Well, they leave the room, or they push the mute, or they turn and chat and say, oh, what did you think of that last scene or whatever? So people studiously avoid the ads. And when I was younger, I don't know if this still goes on, they used to crank up the volume of the ads so that when you went into the kitchen to go get some popcorn, you could still hear the ads. The number of impressions it takes for an ad to leave anything in your mindset is pretty... It's extreme. You're paying a lot. It's not just one ad, one potential customer. You have to hit people dozens of times for them even to have a vague memory. And there have been sort of famous ad campaigns in the past. Like one of the famous ones was, I think it was Wendy's. You know, there was this old woman who's like, would open up this sad little burger and say, where's the beef? Where's the beef? And it didn't really budge. And it was very famous, and, you know, comedians did stuff on it. It went viral and all that. Did it really change the number of people who go to Wendy's to try a burger? Not really. If you remember, Oprah gave away all these cars. Didn't really change things much, even though that became something which people still reference. So this is really, really important to understand, right? There's click fraud. There's people just tuning out ads. There's ad blocking. And there's this whole belief that you can predict somehow what someone's going to buy next based upon their past purchase history. And again, advertisers want to sell you the expensive stuff, but the expensive stuff you only buy on occasion. And you don't necessarily tend to buy things repetitively. If you go for a vacation to Aruba, well, maybe you want to go back to the same place. Maybe you don't. Probably want to go someplace new. You just booked a flight to Rome. Are you going to go back to Rome within the next couple of months? I mean, maybe, I guess, but that's probably for business, in which case consumer advertising doesn't really help you that much. And just think about how you go about buying things. I mean, I'll tell you how I go about buying things if and when I have to. When I go about buying things, I'll do a whole bunch of research. I'll look up review sites. I'll look at comments. I'll, look at the comments of people who've bought stuff. I don't go to ads because everyone understands that the ads are going to be highlighting the positives while, of course, completely eliminating any potential negatives. So, for people who are out there, who are spending money. And I did this way back at the beginning when I was starting this philosophy show. I did some ads in various places. I found one place that wasn't too bad, but most of it was just a complete waste of money. Worse than a waste of money. It's a waste of money and time. And it delayed the start of investing in what I needed to invest in for this show. So all of this, it's just one of these foundational beliefs that people don't often put to an empirical test. People are spending more time online, but they're spending less time looking at ads. And even if they are looking at ads, who knows whether or not past purchases predict future purchases, which is kind of the basis of the whole system. So if you're in business and you want to start making some real coin or saving some real coin, have a look at your online advertising. Poll your employees, see how they go about purchasing things. Just don't assume that it's going to work just because there are a lot of people online. Look at the data. Try and figure out if it's to work or not. And I think the data points that there are some significant questions as to even the basic economic validity of something like online advertising. There are other better ways to get a hold of customers. Like, what you can do, of course, is you can get involved in a big cause, and not something cheesy where your logo is front and center, because that looks kind of manipulative. If you just get involved in a big cause, trust me, people are going to find you if they care about what you're doing and they appreciate it. Be a little tough to find, and then you look much more honorable. That's a way of positively associating your brand with people's perceptions, and it's a way of really getting a message across that is very positive. So, yeah, just have a look at your own behaviors. Ask people around you. Figure out whether it's worth spending one dime on it, because you may be spending a whole lot of money to make some silver farm in Ukraine rich.
Stefan Molyneux on YouTube. Check him out. Subscribe. Now, I think that advertising is going to change how it's you see it, because there is a lot of money being invested in this, and like Procter and Gamble seen that when they stopped investing all this money, it really didn't affect the sales. I think a lot of it's going to start going to people, the people that have an influence. And this is a certain way that you've already kind of seen it happening, where, people that have big followings on YouTube or Twitter or Instagram, people that are popular, they basically get free stuff just to post it online, so their followers go, oh, I want one of those. And we've already kind of seen that transaction. I think we just haven't seen them completely pull out of things like, Google Ads or YouTube and the monetization from that. He talked about click fraud and stuff. There's a lot of what would you call involuntary click fraud, where now a lot of people that watch videos all the time on YouTube, they're YouTube people. That's all they do is, watch videos of their favorite people. And they click every, ad. What was the other one? Trolling their favorite websites and clicking ad services. I've even experienced that with just some of my affiliates, where I've seen lots of clicks on the affiliate link. Well, those are affiliate links. I don't get money because you clicked on it. A lot of what I have, I don't have any click type ones that I get money. I've removed anything like that. It's products that I personally use, companies that I shop through. And if you decide to purchase through those links, then I get, a kickback. But I don't get money because you click on one of the links. It doesn't work that way. Which I really don't need to be paid that way either. I don't do it for the money. And what little money I would get off of you buying something, you buy a seed vault, it will help cover operating costs. That would be basically what it would go to, and that's it. Now, I think what this is going to do is have to change how a lot of these videos and YouTubers are funded. And it'll either be YouTube or another service to pop up where they find the talent, they connect the talent with the companies that fit that, you know, if you're a skateboarder, you know, they're going to connect you with the companies that deal in skateboarding. So when you have all your followers watching your videos of you skateboarding, you know, oh, he's using that type of skateboard with those type of wheels and those bearings, and you know, he likes those shoes, you know, it would follow that type of criteria. It would have to shift away from the ads, unless it's a targeted ad, you know, for the video, which we know that, you know, you watch a video over skateboarding, you're probably going to see an ad for who knows what. They're going to have to change how they do things. Websites. There's going to be a lot of change coming, because there is a lot of reports out in the past year or two that have been showing that maybe this online advertising, the way it's done, is not working. And what I can't remember how long ago it was, but there was a report out that was saying that a lot of the ads that Google and YouTube have, where they suspended a lot of accounts, or claim click fraud, or you know, copyright claims, or you know, just not advertiser friendly, and remove monetization, and basically take that money from the YouTuber or the website that uses Google Ads, and they still are charging the advertisers. So they're basically pocketing the money. And if you think about, well, you know, I could name maybe 5 or 6, 7 accounts that lost monetization for multiple reasons. Other websites that, you know, are libertarian, constitutionalist, you can claim conspiracy theorists. Even mine, that was 3 or 4 years ago, and then they gave it back, and then they took it away, and then they gave it back, and that was without me even being able to do anything. Like, they were just, yep, you have it, oh, you don't, yep, you have it, yep, you don't. It was almost like there were 2 people inside the company or something going, oh, I like that, oh, I don't like that, oh, I like that, oh, I don't like that. I have no idea. But again, I really just, I didn't want to deal with Google or YouTube in that sense. I like my affiliates, and Amazon being one of them. It's just services that actually benefit you, benefit me. I use them. And at the, you know, same time, if I get a little kickback, I do. If not, at least, you know, maybe you shop through some of the, you know, like My Patriot Supply, without going through my, like, well, you know, you found a company that you got deals that you liked and like the product that they have. That's really what it's about, because I think that things are changing, and we have seen a radical transformation of America. And where it goes from here, we really don't know. We have a Republican, and it's not a neocon, but he's surrounded by neocons. And he's unpredictable. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't even know what he's thinking half of the time. Okay, give me a second here. Trying to get this up here. It works. If it's gonna go. Okay, that website's not gonna load for us. See, I don't know what's going on. Ads load with the article load. Okay, I guess we'll just move along here. Okay. This is going to work. So hopefully we got that. Now, I have another one here from Stefan Molyneux.
Hi, everybody. Stefan Molyneux from...
And this one is covering what seems to be a collapse in South Africa, or the coming collapse. I'm only going to play a portion of this. It's an interview with Dan Root. And I kind of wanted to talk about this because South Africa, with apartheid and all that, and they've had the whole racial issue and, kind of the arguments we see in America, except if you look at those arguments of apartheid in South Africa compared to the conditions that we have people protesting here in America, you would see that we're way ahead of where they were, but now they're experiencing a collapse there. And it amazes me because we see so much complaining here about really, I think, arbitrary problems, societal issues that people are like, I don't know, protesting government to do something about, that are very small issues when you look at conditions in other countries and what they've been through and what they're still going through. But we'll go ahead and play a little bit of this clip here. I don't want to get too far into this. It's a long clip, and I urge people to go listen to the whole thing on YouTube. But here we go.
Hope you're doing well. I have an essential conversation for you to listen to. We are here with Dan Root. He is a well-known Afrikaner commentator and the author of many books, including Raiders of the Lost Empire, South Africa's English Identity, The Scourge of the ANC, the African National Congress, and Johannesburg in 5. Root also founded the Pro-Afrikaans Action Group, PRAAG, in the year 2000, and you can find out more about that organization at Prague, praag.co.za. And you can follow Dan on Twitter at twitter.com/Dan Root, and that's ROOD. Gee, Dan, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you very much, Stefan.
So I have visited South Africa twice when I was younger, and I remember getting embroiled in the late 80s and the early 90s, at a time when the Western media was hysterically denouncing South Africa and its white rule in truly apocalyptic, downright Nazi terms. And I remember having debates saying, it's complicated, it's complex. You know, one man, one vote, one person, one vote is most likely to end up with tribal warfare, with the decay of the economy, and certainly with a pillaging of the past resources built up by white rule and a resulting collapse in the currency. I wonder if you could help people to understand why South Africa was so central to the narrative in the 80s and 90s, and why it has vanished from Western consciousness and the Western media as the promised land has failed to materialize.
Well, I think it also has to do with the evolution of Western society post-war. You know, during the 1960s, we had the famous kind of leftward turn in the West, and the rise of all the counterculture movements, hippie movements, and also, especially in Europe, you had a lot of Marxism, leftism, even Maoism coming through, the 1968 student uprising in Paris. And I think that particular generation of politicians or young people, they then moved into positions of power towards the late 70s and early 80s. You also had somebody like Jimmy Carter in the US, who was in power in the late 70s. And that gave an impetus to this whole anti-South African campaign. And it was an orchestrated propaganda campaign against South Africa. And I think it must be one of the few examples where a country, or a regime rather, such as we had, capitulated simply because of a kind of a propaganda onslaught, or a kind of a semantic war, to use a term kind of popularized recently by Marine Le Pen, which I quite like, the notion of a semantic war, that you're actually changing the meanings and simply through manipulating messages and media can you actually bring down an entire country. And that's exactly what happened in South Africa. And, I think our people, the Afrikaners, were quite naive in certain respects, and they completely underestimated this whole propaganda thing. And they thought that, if they did the right thing and built enough hospitals and schools and so on for black people, and they also had a strong enough army that they could withstand any form of assault on us. And and they saw the main thrust of the anti-South African campaign coming from the ex-Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and China to a lesser extent. But I think they never envisaged that it would come mostly from the Western countries. And, the core Western countries, USA, UK, France, the Netherlands, and of course, Scandinavia. Scandinavia actually financed the whole thing almost single-handedly. In fact, in 2004, the Swedish ambassador was on the radio here in South Africa, and he said on air that without Sweden, the ANC would never have come to power. And I think he was very much right. And I expected some sort of at least media attention to that statement after he'd made it. But there was just deadly silence afterwards. And I think but I think you can still quote him on that. And I perfectly agree with that.
Right. Now, let's talk a little bit about the relationship between the ANC and communism. And I've talked in a number of presentations about how the communists, almost as soon as they seized power in the brutal deposition or deposing of the Romanovs, they immediately set about attempting to use racial tensions in the West to begin to destabilize the West. And not many people understand the relationship between communism and what has been called the civil rights movement, but it seems very explicit with the ANC.
Oh, yes. Ironically, the ANC was almost a front for the Communist Party. And in fact, there was a famous kind of gathering around about 1968 in Tanzania. As far as I know, it was a kind of game reserve there called Ngorongoro, and the Tanzanian government under Julius Nyerere had put it at the disposal of the ANC to have their conference because they hadn't actually met in years. And the entire movement was, in fact, moribund. I mean, in the 1964 famous or infamous Rivonia trial when Mandela and Goldberg and all these people were jailed, after that, the whole thing petered out, and there were only a few exiled ANC members and Communist Party members left overseas who'd actually fled the country. And the whole thing was being kept alive by a grant from the Soviet embassy in London. The Soviet embassy was giving them £30,000 a year to keep the entire thing going. And I mean, you probably, and anybody would realize that, I mean, you can't overthrow kind of a medium-sized power like South Africa was at the time with £30,000 per annum. I mean, you wouldn't get very far at all. I mean, that hardly paid for, I mean, the salaries of the main figures in the movement. But in 1968, they had that meeting in Ngorongoro, and apparently some members of the ANC were actually ready to throw in the towel. And one of the members of the Communist Party was actually saying that, I mean, we're talking about the war against South Africa and overthrowing the regime and revolution and so on, but it's all just a big fantasy. And up to now, we haven't shown any proof of that, or we haven't really struck any blow against South Africa at all. But then, old Joe Slovo, who was the stalwart of the South African Communist Party, actually foreign born. He was born in Lithuania, only came to South Africa at the age of 10 or 11, and then got involved in kind of trade unions in Johannesburg and in the Communist Party. From the 1940s onwards, he also had a wife called Ruth First, who was also a raving communist. Her dad was also a communist. In fact, her dad might have been, I'm not sure if he was the leader of the party or one of the leaders, but he was very active in the communist movement in South Africa at the time. But in 1968, they were ready to actually stop the whole thing and can it. And then old Joe Slovo stood up and said, no, we just write up a document and we'll get funding and eventually we'll get the whole thing going again. And then it sort of ended on a slightly more optimistic note. But in fact, if it hadn't been for the Swedish money that started flowing soon afterwards, because Olof Palme came to power in 1968 in Sweden, and there was a small group of communists in South Africa, including the Nobel Prize-winning author Nathan Gordimer, who was part of that circle. And there was also a Swedish journalist by the name of Per Westberg. And they together persuaded Olof Palme and the Swedish parliament eventually to vote this secret budget for the ANC. And then the money started flowing and they could use it for propaganda, and eventually, they had these sort of so-called military training camps in a few African countries, in Tanzania, but also in Zambia later on. But they never actually managed to, to muster any sort of military challenge to South Africa. It was all on the level of urban terror and propaganda. And terrorism is sometimes described as propaganda through deeds. And, when you place a bomb in a supermarket or something, it causes a lot of publicity, and it has a great effect on the population. And that was the whole purpose of that kind of warfare. In fact, fairly recently, I'd come into contact with an elderly lady. She was liberal, or she's sort of become more conservative now, but her father was a liberal politician in the 1950s in South Africa. He was a member of parliament. I think his surname was Friedman. And she explained to me that she'd had some contact with these communists in the 50s in Johannesburg, and one of them had come to her father's house and told him about this new form of warfare, which entailed both propaganda and urban terrorism, and whether he wouldn't like to join up with the movement, but he then declined. But there was a whole discussion apparently going on at the time, and they eventually, shortly after 1960, decided on doing this, and because they couldn't really get much popular support at all in South Africa. And in the 1960s, economically, we were so successful, there was full employment in the country, and there weren't any real grievances among most of the population, except now for in a sort of an abstract philosophical way, the whole system as it was at the time, which wasn't entirely democratic. There was a kind of democratic system for whites, and to a lesser extent for coloreds and Indians. But apart from the black homelands, the urban blacks were excluded from the whole voting system, although they could vote for municipalities. But eventually, even this kind of inchoate democratic system was also sabotaged by the revolutionary movement, in that they started attacking anyone who participated in the official structures and elections and so on. And they literally killed or murdered town councillors and so on. And through there's another very interesting book by a lady called Dr. Anthea Jeffrey, and she still works as a researcher for the local Institute for Race Relations, which is a kind of a liberal think tank in South Africa that has existed for years. I've even got some of the reports going back to the 1930s. And she wrote a book entitled People's War. And this was the concept that the ANC and the Communist Party apparently had studied in Vietnam, in North Vietnam, towards 1978 or so. Vietnam was then ruled, of course, by the revolutionaries after the fall of Saigon in 1973. And they explained to them that the main thrust of your warfare was not against the enemy, but against your own people. That you have to, by means of terror and intimidation, you have to cow anyone who goes against your ideas and your movement. And anybody who's critical and also who cooperates with a so-called enemy, those people should be targeted. And that's how they also devised this so-called necklace method of executing people by placing a tire around their necks and dousing it with petrol, gasoline, and then setting it alight. And up to 400 people were killed like that in various black townships around South Africa. But eventually, the propaganda campaign wore on, and it ultimately overwhelmed the old National Party. I think P.W. Botha, who was the last president to actually offer resistance to this, but he started getting a lot of flack from the local media as well. And then he was eventually betrayed by his own cabinet, and they went against him, and he had to resign, and he was then replaced by Mr. de Klerk, who went the whole hog, as they say, and simply handed power on a plate to the ANC and the Communist Party.
Well, but to be fair, he didn't think he was doing that. I mean, he, I think, was delusional enough about race relations to imagine that the blacks were all going to vote for him, and it was going to continue as before. And, of course, that was the ideal. Nobody claimed that they wanted to destroy South African prosperity or destroy rights for the white minority and so on. It was, of course, supposed to improve everything, and de Klerk does seem to have really believed all of that stuff.
Yes, I think you're quite right. I mean, he had a kind of a sense of his own omnipotence, which I think was caused partially by the huge wave of publicity he got when he took the step of releasing Mandela and unbanning the ANC and the Communist Party. And then he turned into a kind of darling of the Western media. And one of the local journalists also told me once that during the negotiations in the early 1990s, the main negotiator of the National Party, Rolf Meyer, who actually eventually did join the ANC, he was more concerned with communicating with the foreign media than with the local media. The local journalists couldn't get an interview with him, but if you were from the Financial Times or the New York Times or the Guardian in London, he would leave everything and speak to you right there and then. So they were trying to please the foreign media more than anything else. And I mean, they swallowed this whole notion of the integrated multicultural society that was being bandied about at the time, and that had already shown, all sorts of cracks and fissures in the USA. And I think the other thing that has often occurred to me is that we didn't have television until about 1976. So which in a way was very good for us, because we spent our time reading and listening to the radio and going to the opera and things like that. We had a much more traditional culture because we didn't have TV. But in 76, we then got it. And shortly after that, of course, the Soweto riots broke out. And I think the government didn't realize what sort of explosive potential these images of police, the police confronting crowds of black people and shooting and violence and blood and so on would cause overseas. And even though that wasn't planned at all by the ANC and the SACP, I mean, to them it was just a windfall that came to them. But we weren't that aware of the preceding history in the USA during the 1960s when they had race riots and the effect that had in the USA. So I think they should have been a lot more prepared for that kind of thing and kind of anticipated it. But when it happened, they were quite unprepared. And that's also why there was, an unfortunate loss of life also during the riots, which was then used to point fingers at the government and just how fascist and Nazi-like and so on they were. And, of course, there was that famous picture of Hector Peterson, which, was sent all over the world. But apparently the same photographer had taken pictures the very same day or the next day of a white policeman, as far as I recall, who was himself massacred. He was slaughtered on the spot. And he took pictures of that, but those pictures never made it into print anywhere.
Well, of course. I mean, every time there's white on black violence, it is shot to the very top, page one, top of the fold, that black and white violence must be ruthlessly suppressed, even though these statistics are far greater in the West.
And
black and
ironically, Hector Peterson, in that famous photo, he was shot by a black policeman, almost by accident, because he'd wandered into the line of fire between some rioters and these policemen. So he wasn't shot by a white policeman, but of course the black policeman was seen as acting on behalf of the white minority government, so-called.
Now let's talk a little bit about South Africa in the past, because a lot of people who think of it as the pariah nation outside the bounds of the West, outside the Western tradition, rejected and scorned by European civilization and its derivatives. But this is not the case. It was an honored member of the West, of course,
exactly.
As you pointed out in your videos. South African troops have fought in both of the world wars and other conflicts, and there were good trade relations, good cultural relations.
Exactly.
The turning of the West on South Africa is a relatively recent phenomenon. For the previous set of couple of centuries, this was not the case at all.
Yes, you're quite right. In fact, I would say that it really started in the early 1960s, and especially during the tenure of Dr. Verwoerd. He was a very competent man, and you might not agree with him, but he had this notion that of so-called separate development, and that blacks should be developed in their own areas and using their own culture, and there shouldn't be a blanket westernization of Africans. And in some respects, his ideas correspond to what some of the more radical black nationalists are saying today, and what they've been saying for quite a number of years. But it started. There was even a visit by the Russian-born composer Stravinsky, who then lived in the USA in around 1962, and he performed here. And then there were voices on the sort of more or less on the left or the extreme liberal wing of the opposition at the time who said that he shouldn't come to South Africa, But there weren't any boycotts, there weren't any sports boycotts. That only started in the 1970s, really. And I think it sort of reached a high point in the 1980s. But of course, Reagan fended off sanctions on South Africa, and he was eventually then, his presidential veto was overturned in the USA at the behest of the Black Caucus in America. And in fact, the Republicans went against their own president and voted with the Black Caucus in order to overturn his presidential veto against sanctions on South Africa. But coming back to the issue of South Africa being part of the Western system, yes, throughout the 20th century, we were part of the Western system. We were part of the founding of the British Commonwealth in 1931. We had one of the Boer War generals, one of the Boer generals, Jan Smuts. He was a very brilliant man he was the first person in the UK to pass both law examinations at Cambridge in 1 year. It was kind of an astounding feat. He was almost a genius, old Smuts. And he fought, on the Boer side, he was actually the state attorney of the Transvaal Republic at the time. But after the war, and especially when we got self-rule again in 1910, he became more pro-British, and because he'd studied in the UK at Cambridge, and eventually he became one of the major figures in the British Commonwealth. And in fact, you can even now find it online. There's black and white footage during the Second World War of a meeting of both houses of Parliament in the UK being addressed by Smuts, and where Churchill introduces him, and then he gets a standing ovation from both the House of Lords and the lower house in Britain, and they looked up to him as one of the leaders in the Western world. And he is reputed also, because he was a lawyer by training, he was reputed to also have been very active in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Constitution of the United Nations. So from that moment onwards, where we were seen as part of the family of Western nations, we fell to, as you put it, into this abyss where we were considered to be a pariah state. And that was purely the effect of, this huge propaganda campaign that was deliberately being orchestrated against us in the Western media. And, of course, there were intelligence agencies involved as well, and especially the East German intelligence agency, because there was I read Joe Slovo's biography not so long ago, a few years ago, and there was a lot of contact between Joe Slovo and Marcus Wolf, who was the head of the East German intelligence at the time. And they also devised this whole strategy of undermining South Africa's image in the world, and also setting up some sort of counterintelligence network to our intelligence network. And they also supplied them with explosives and detonators and so on for their terrorism campaign in South Africa. We had about 200 terrorist incidents. So it's very ironic today, that truck that killed the people in Stockholm, where Sweden is now experiencing terror firsthand, but during the 70s and 80s, they were actually financing it against us here in South Africa.
Well, this kind of blowback is something I want to get to in a few minutes. And just when I was watching your interviews and reading some of your articles, Dan, before this conversation, it struck me when you were talking about how the ANC took over in 1994. 1994 was, of course, when the ANC took over chief political power in South Africa. It was also the year that the Bell Curve was published, the book by Herrnstein and Murray, talking about racial differences in IQ. And one of the great challenges is that, of course, the communists say, well, everyone's equal, and the only reason that there are inequalities is due to oppression. Now, if you accept that standpoint, that everyone's just kind of one big blob, we're all chess pieces that are pawns, there's no kings, no bishops, or anything like that, then the only differences in outcome, in wealth or political influence, can result from exploitation. And so if you take that Marxist paradigm, then you look for the countries with the greatest wealth disparities, and you say, aha, this must be where there is the most exploitation. And that, I think, was what drove the ANC, and it drives the communist world model. The other explanation, which is actually founded in IQ science and genetic research and brain size measurements and so on, is to say, well, there are discrepancies in IQ within groups, like within whites, within blacks, and between groups as well. It doesn't allow you to judge any individual, but when you zoom out enough, you can look at the big picture. And one of the explanations is to say, well, in sub-Saharan Africa, blacks have an average IQ of 70, which means that if you give them equal votes to whites who have an average IQ of 100, you are going to end up with a much shorter time preference, much more corruption, many more problems in your society. And the blacks, of course, had been running, to some degree, South Africa for tens of thousands of years before the whites came along, hadn't achieved a whole lot. The whites come along, and their standard of living increases for the blacks. The number of blacks increases because of better farming methods. They have better access to modern medicine. Infant mortality goes down, which is, I think, why you were talking about there were few problems in the 50s and 60s. And, of course, when I was there, I remember talking to people saying one of the big problems is that blacks are desperate to get into South Africa from other black-run countries. So these two explanations of human disparities, one being the bell curve and the other being communism, I think came to a head in 1994. And I think people's unwillingness to admit that Herrnstein and Murray made a very good case, a solid case that was later verified by the American Psychological Association and has been verified endlessly ever since. People seem to want to reject that science and reject that basic reality and return back to this Platonic dream of human egalitarianism that, when implemented, so often results in tyranny and dysfunction. In fact, always, I think.
Yes, well, you've touched on quite a controversial topic there, but it's a very interesting one. I went to a university here in Johannesburg called the University of the Witwatersrand, which is also sort of like some sort of Marxist re-education camp when I was there. It was just amazing. In fact, in the first year, our set text in political science was The State in Capitalist Society, which was written by one Ralph Miliband, who was a friend of Joe Slovo's. And in fact, his two sons, Ed and David, later became very prominent figures in British politics, on the Labour Party side. But in fact, I'd never heard of this notion that there were differences in IQ between blacks and whites. And it was only when I read the first review of the bell curve in the Wall Street Journal, and I was really intrigued by this. And then one weekend, I got the flu and I couldn't sleep. And as it happened, I bought the last hardcover copy of the bell curve at the bookshop at the shopping center near where I lived. And I read the thing through in one sitting, all 1,000 pages of it or whatever. And it was absolutely fascinating. And yes, and it did give me some insight into, the role of intelligence and IQ in life. And even among, even among Europeans, it stands to reason that there's only a small percentage of really gifted people in society who turn into rocket scientists or inventors and brilliant engineers and so on. And in South Africa, of course, there's constant talk of the inequality and persistent inequality in South Africa, even though whites are now being deliberately excluded from the job market and being deliberately impoverished. If you're a white person today without some sort after university degree, only with high school diploma, then you won't find a job. You'll have to then become an entrepreneur, or you'll have to work in a small business, perhaps run by other white people or have relatives or so on. And a lot of those people fall through the cracks and they end up in slums and so-called squatter camps. But the notion, that blacks could, without the shackles of segregation and apartheid and so on, within a few years, they would turn into academic stars, and you would have a narrowing of the so-called achievement gap that you also have in the USA between blacks and whites. That was very persistent here in liberal thinking.
Okay, I'm going to stop it right there. Now, you hear this, and I do believe that there is a lot of racial issues within the book that they're speaking of. I have not read it from cover to cover because I did find disparities in this. And I'll get to the point of this clip that I want to point to issues that are relevant, and it's relevant because it's happening here in a whole different way, but it's the same propaganda, the same narrative, the same push in politics and in the social environment here in America. But I want to touch on where I see disparities in the book, and it comes down to, the whites with the higher IQ. I know plenty of white people with very low IQ, and it's not because they don't have access to education. It's not. They live in a culture, and I've always related this to. A lot of these studies come from what they would call civilized areas. Well, civilized areas would be the city. Well, we do see a very segregated approach to city life, but inner city, no matter what race, tends to produce eventually, and not always, because you do have immigrants that come in that the first, couple generations will hold on to a lot of their culture from home, which would usually be a lot of times more conservative. A lot of Hispanic people that are, devout Catholics that have came here. First couple generations very religious, and then again, if they're in the inner city, which most immigrants are, you watch that couple generations of children then fall into that inner city culture. And I've always said, you have two type of inner city cultures: the inner city culture of the more wealthy people and the people that live in the suburbs and rural areas that come into the city, and they experience, the nightclub and the shopping and all of that. And then you have the inner city culture of the people that live in the inner city that aren't wealthy. And that culture is completely different. And, when you look a lot of times, and this has changed in, the past 20 years, and I've seen statistics that showed this, and it became when they had to make sure that, every school had the right amount of black people, the right amount of, minorities, and there's nothing wrong with that. If you live out here, you go to the school. Who cares what color you are or what race? But it's when they started going, well, to do that, we need to, go to the inner city because that's where the densest population is. So that's where you're going to find the most people that then you can bus around. So the inner city culture is now really gets, brought out to the suburbs all the time. And a lot of those issues that you see heavily in the inner city have now, spread to the suburbs. It's not too much different other than the parents might have a little more money, but the kids are still, in that culture of inner city because they have to be cool like the rest of the people that go to their school, and their the little cliques and all that. Again, it becomes that collectivism. But, you do see, minority families that move more out to the suburbs. And when I was in school, you seen it more then because it was just getting to that point where you start really seeing it out in the suburbs. But then there were some schools where it was still more that suburban lifestyle. And it didn't matter what race they were from. They had the same IQ as a white person. They didn't have lower IQ. A lot, again, that comes from a lot of the inner city. And again, I know where I grew up here in Indiana. The inner city, you had the white inner city people, the Hispanic inner city people, the blacks, Asians. And there was a culture that went from every race that they did not want to learn anything. They weren't there to learn. They had to be cool. They had to be trendy. That was the deal, and then, time high school, who's making money, who's, that inner city lifestyle. So I see a lot of problems with that book. And when you look at the so-called science as presented, that holds up to a certain extent, but it does not include modern cultures, definitely like in America. And really looking at how inner city culture, no matter what culture or race, that inner city lifestyle. And it's because a lot of poor people in the inner city, they're trapped. They don't have a crap load of options. A lot of it comes down to a brainwashing into like this cognitive dissonance of reality, and really understanding, look, you know, everything you need to get out of that situation and bring yourself up out, you know, you can get a lot of that knowledge at school. I think, honestly, our schools are too slow. We you know, teach things way too slowly. But that's me. So you can listen to the rest of that. Now, real quickly, if you hear a lot of the examples of the propaganda and the social construct and the social engineering behind a lot of what the communists and the socialists use, and you look at where we are now in American politics and how society is reacting, you see a lot of the beginnings. Now we'll get to the extremes that you've seen. Well, we've seen Molotov cocktails and things like that already starting to pop up. You know, how extreme does it get? That's to be seen. But we see a lot of the same strategies being used. And that can be scary in itself right there. Okay, we are getting towards the end of the broadcast. And I want to play this real short clip from We Are Change and cover this real quick because we'll have just enough time to do that. So let's hurry up and get into this little short clip here.
Burmis here, reporting for wearechange.org. And today I wanted to talk to you about this whole North Korean missile non-crisis that the media and government alike are shoving down our throats.
Now North Korea's reckless pursuit of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles threatens the entire world with unthinkable loss of human life.
Breaking tonight, brand new threats from North Korea as they warn the U.S. of the, quote, greatest pain and suffering.
So we're out of time now in North Korea.
We will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
Are you one of the authors of Rocket Man as a way to describe Kim Jong-un? Do you think that kind of rhetoric helps? Well, it's an accurate term.
We should never accept a North Korea with nuclear weapons.
Don't they already have them?
That's part of the problem. So I think we're at a very perilous point.
Now, this narrative is extremely dangerous because if something were to happen in this country and it had any ties to North Korea, or perhaps had no ties at all, they would probably be the first target at this point, at least if it was a weapon of sophistication. And here's why I'm going to tell you that is utterly impossible. In 1983, Reagan put into motion a program rarely talked about these days called Star Wars. It ran until 1993, and guess what, folks? It used directed energy weapons as well as ground systems and space-based weapons to knock out ballistic missiles. Now, we would be totally foolish and amiss to think that this program was scrapped or unsuccessful. In fact, it looks as though it was highly successful. Just this week, Lockheed Martin has shown Athena its directed energy weapon, aka laser weapon, and it easily shot down 4 drone targets. Now, is this technology publicly available to knock out ballistic missiles yet? Perhaps not. The fact of the matter is we have no idea what kind of technology the military has, as most of its cutting-edge technology is still classified. Now, another reason this is extremely dangerous is if there were to be an attack in this country and it were to be blamed on North Korea, it would more than likely be a false flag. And unfortunately, although many of his supporters will not admit it, Trump has been guided by the banksters and the military personnel that do want to bring about war in this country. And it's extremely dangerous. Remember all of his talk about non-interventionist policy? Yet, as soon as something happened in Syria, he bombs them.
I now have responsibility, and I will have that responsibility and carry it very proudly. It crossed a lot of lines for me. When you kill innocent children, innocent babies, little babies, with a chemical gas that is so lethal, people were shocked to hear what gas it was. That crosses many, many lines, beyond the red line, many, many lines.
Myself and the global public alike are still awaiting the evidence that Assad gassed his own people, as this has been wrongly accused of him before and proven to be a lie.
During our investigation for crimes against humanity and war crimes, we collect some witness testimony that made to appear that some chemical weapons were used, in particular nervine gas. And what appeared on to our investigation that was used by the opponents, by the rebels.
Folks, we really have to take a look at where this is going with North Korea, because this could be a very, very dangerous mistake. As always, if you like this video, please share it on social media, hit the subscribe button, follow me on Twitter at
We Are Change, wearechange.org, We Are Change on YouTube. Now, I don't think that our lasers are quick enough and powerful enough to take down a, missile, but you never know. But the rhetoric, I think that if we're ever closer to another world war, we're kind of getting there with all the back and forth rhetoric and almost words that now, depending on the ego, will he back his rhetoric? Or is he using the rhetoric like he did during the campaign, and what he actually does is something different? I think in our world positioning right now, our best bet would to kind of withdraw from the world a little bit. Let other people have their conflicts. And Trump did say in his little speech about other countries taking care of their own issues and own areas of the world taking care of their own issues. Hopefully that part's true, where we can stop trying to police the world. I think that right there would be one of the best things. If we rarely spoke, and when we did, it was with wisdom. because I think that's what a lot of the world respected about us before. That we rarely spoke. When we did, there was a little wisdom behind it. And if we had to act, we were kind of swift with it. So, really, with all this rhetoric, it goes to that back and forth where you don't really know exactly what's going to come out of it, if it's just going to be talk, or if now people are going to feel like the rhetoric needs backed up by action. And, this is what I talked about before, is I don't like the simple fact that Trump is so reliant on his military commanders, and people are like, oh, you got to support the military and the generals. There's a military-industrial complex. They are there to fight war. They will find a war to fight. As the commander-in-chief, your responsibility is to be like, calm down, soldier, when the need arises, we'll be there. But instead, we've allowed the military-industrial complex to really run the presidency. Therefore, the president's like, so what do you need to do? What do you want to do? I want to go fight a war. Okay. What war you want to go fight? I want to go fight over here. I got a strategy. And we know Trump basically kind of gave the reins to the military to do what they feel they should or want to do. And I think that counts out the ability for cooler heads to prevail. Because we know China would not back North Korea if they launched first or did something first. So I don't think North Korea would. Provoking people is a way, launching missiles in the middle of a sea. That didn't work. Let's launch them over a landmass and see if that provokes someone. Many people might also claim that they're testing the waters. How can they get away with it? But sometimes you have to wait for something actually to happen to justify it. I want to thank everybody for tuning in tonight. Stay tuned here on UCY.tv. Great broadcast coming up after this. Don't forget to go to UCY.tv. Scroll down the bottom, click the Amazon button. Shop Amazon through UCY.tv. Get the same great price, the same great shipping rate. And UCY gets a little kickback to help cover operating costs. And they also have a support tab if you would like to donate to UCY.tv. And don't forget, My Patriot Supply, great seed vaults and food preparedness for emergency situations. If you were down during the hurricanes, this is stuff that you might want around. Check them out. Go to antityrannynews.com/MyPatriot. It'll take you straight to My Patriot Supply. And again, thank you.